Okay, recommend the English and Kate piece of gno over river Shea, Rochester, Keshnana, agus Fragri, Conan Taoiseach, agus an Kate Kaintor no an Taoiseach, and Chachta Leo Fradker, Hishik Ta Denham made agat.
It's now more than 100 days since the first recorded case of COVID-19 in our state, 92 days since the first person died from the virus, and 91 days since we instituted the first set of measures to suppress the spread of the virus and protect as many people as possible from its deadly power. In total, today, as always, we think of the 1,695 people who, as of last night, have died from or with COVID-19, and a further 537 who've died in Northern Ireland. Their lives shone brightly and were brought to an end before their time. As in Oireachtas, we seek to honour their lives as we mourn their deaths. In total, 25,231 people in the Republic of Ireland have been diagnosed with COVID-19. 92% have recovered fully, with more on the mend. Some 367,780 tests have been carried out, including 19,364 in the past week, of which 185 were positive, resulting in a positivity rate of less than 1% for the first time. That's down from a peak of 20% back in April. This rate continues to decline and is very encouraging. It indicates that the easing of restrictions on our economy and people has not enabled the virus to make a comeback, at least not so far. Last Thursday, when I spoke in the Dáil, we had 47 new cases recorded the evening before. Yesterday evening, it was 19. This time last week, we had 36 people in ICU. That's down to 29. And 165 in hospital with COVID. That's down to 92. It's 42 days since we published the roadmap to reopen our country, and 4 days since we moved into Phase 2+, enabling us to take small but meaningful steps to where we want to be when this is over. The Government is now conducting extensive work with the help of NEFID on the revised Phase 3 and Phase 4 of the roadmap, so we can have the country almost fully opened by the middle of July instead of the middle of August as originally planned. However, some measures, such as public health advice and bans on mass gatherings, may need to continue for some time. These are still the early stages, so it's too soon to evaluate how Phase 2+ is going, but the early indications are favourable. As a country, we're optimistic but cautious. We're hopeful while avoiding unnecessary risk. In the fine balancing act that our lives have become, we are getting things right more often than not. Our plan is working, and we should stick to it. It all depends, of course, on us continuing to keep the virus under control, and there's always a risk that it might make a comeback. But the last couple of days have been quite encouraging, notwithstanding the daily tragedy of new notified deaths to the Department of Health. We're continuing to secure and stockpile supplies of PPE in case there's a second wave in the future, and improve testing and tracing turnaround times. In this way, we can deal with resurgences locally without having to bring in major restrictions across the country again. As part of Phase 2, the Cabinet made a decision to get childcare services reopened because so much of our recovery depends on it. From the 29th of June, childcare services can reopen to ensure that one more obstacle is removed from stressed and anxious parents. We are, of course, all aware that very many childcare services close in the months in July and August, but we would anticipate that the vast majority of those that usually open for the summer months will reopen at the end of June. Whether it's health or social care workers or parents unable to return to work otherwise, the reopening of childcare centres provides reassurance and makes what they do possible. It's also necessary to ensure that vulnerable children, as well as those who are homeless, experiencing poverty or disadvantage or child welfare issues, are looked out for. I want to extend my thanks to Minister Zappone and her officials for the work that they've done to make all this possible. Thanks to everyone's hard work in pushing back the spread of the virus, it's now safe to implement a summer programme for children with special educational needs and disadvantaged children. There will be a particular emphasis on social inclusion programmes such as the School Completion Programme, as well as numeracy and literacy programmes for deaf schools. I believe it is right and appropriate that we're prioritising those at greatest risk of educational disadvantage. It's also right that students with special educational needs benefit from the opportunities provided by the programme and don't miss out on this year. In line with public health guidance, the summer programme will be a home-based and school-based one and will be supported by the HSE as well as the Department of Education. So much will depend on schools, teachers and special needs assistants choosing to participate. And I know that everyone will do what they can to make sure this works. But I do appeal to schools, teachers and special needs assistants, please do participate, because we can't do this without you. The focus of the programme will be on students and young people with complex needs, including those who have significant behavioural, social, emotional and sensory difficulties. Children with Down syndrome will be included and will be able to participate and benefit from what's on offer. Minister McHugh and Minister Harris will bring specific proposals to Cabinet tomorrow for approval. A bhuíochas den Hibertí Móra rinne an pobal chun scapu an vírus a thúngu agus daoine eile a cosint, bhí sé slán leanú a raig leis an dara céim den blan a thosnú conardír a oscailt ar an luan. Tugann an seachtain seo gach eile cúis a bheith dóchasach agus dearfach i le na todhchaí. Tá na sríanta á laidú agus tá daoine ag dul ar ais ag obair. Tá na siopaí ag a oscailt. Agus tá ardír ag a oscailt. Ach tá muid fós a géirí ar daoine go leanfaí siad a raig leis na cleachtaí cearta a bhí á dhéanamh acu ar nós. Fanacht amach go fisicach ó dhaoine eile. Ja nós féireacht casachtach a chhlaachú. Táistáil nach bhfuil gá leis a sheachant. Agus le ling na drí seachtaní a thugging fan áitiúla. Inis tá ag déanamh planála chun dlús a chur ar na bartas na céimeanna eile, le gá ceann fós le gol. Mar cuide táid ag déanamh planála chun tuairseoireacht agus fáilteachas a tosnú ar an níl lá is fiche den bheitheh. Níl an saoirí caiilte againn, agus má cuineamid ag déanamh na rudaí ceart, is féidirling a bheith dóchasach faoi cad atá in an-doing. Ceann Comhairle, when we began phase 1 of the roadmap, the Health and Safety Authority initiated a new national programme of inspections to ensure the safety of employees and customers when shops and businesses reopened. Between the 18th of May and the 5th of June, over 1,200 inspections were carried out by the authority, with more than 1,000 relating specifically to the return to work protocol. These inspections were completed across a range of industry sectors, including construction, which accounted for close to half of all inspections. An initial analysis of specific COVID-19 inspections shows that employers are generally taking a responsible and proactive approach. Approximately 3/4 of employers had a response plan in place. 8 in 10 had completed employee induction training, 9 in 10 had COVID control measures in place. The HSA checklists and templates to drive implementation of the protocol have now been downloaded over 30,000 times. So I want to thank employers, employees and business organisations and trade unions for their contribution and for helping us to get back to work and to get businesses open. The HSA is now working on further material for lead worker representatives and supporting a range of stakeholder groups as they seek to develop their own plans for a safe return. I know that this pandemic has hit some sections of society harder than others, and some of those who could least withstand it have suffered the most. Last Friday, the government considered the impact of the pandemic on people with disabilities, travellers, members of the Roma community, vulnerable migrants, among others. We know the Gardaí have charged over 100 men with domestic abuse offences in recent weeks, and that unfortunately for some, the message of stay at home meant they could not stay safe, because their homes are not safe places. To all those living in fear because of domestic abuse or having experienced violence, I'm deeply sorry that the restrictions have made things more difficult for you. But there are people available to help. The Gardaí are just a phone call away. Or if you want to talk to someone first, please reach out to family and friends. or call one of the government-supported helplines. The Department of Justice is carrying out an analysis of the gender implications of the pandemic, and this work will inform the next iteration of the Social Implications Report and shape the actions we will take to help those most at risk. Ceann Comhairle, as Professor Philip Nolan explained to the Special Committee on COVID-19 response on Tuesday, the government's strategy is not one of mitigation, it is one of suppression, suppressing the virus to very low levels, to zero if possible, by keeping the R number well below 1. Unfortunately, as he noted, no strategy utterly insulates us from the risk of the virus re-emerging in our society. We share an open land border with Northern Ireland, which has unrestricted travel with Great Britain, and that is a Westminster competence, not a Stormont one. Our society, our economy, our personal liberties are European, and we're deeply implemented with the European Union. Indeed, we're European citizens. So closing ourselves off from the rest of the world is not an option for Ireland in the medium to long term. So we need to be prepared for the risk of imported cases as we reopen slowly to other countries. We need a testing and tracing system capable of identifying new cases, new clusters, and a resurgence of the virus quickly, so we can contain it, and so we do not need to return to a national lockdown again. I'm confident we can do that. When we make our decisions, whether to restrict the way we live at the start of this emergency or to reopen our country now, we have at all times followed the fundamental principle of protecting lives and not doing harm. And we know there are many types of harm. It's lost lives, but it can also be lost livelihoods. It's the damage to our children's education, the impact of a prolonged period of isolation on our mental health, or the harm caused by delaying treatment for non-COVID related illnesses or diseases, also known as secondary deaths. So in the weeks ahead, we'll continue to follow this approach of minimising harm and protecting lives as we work to rebuild our economy, reopen our country, and realise our vision for a safe, secure and sustainable new way of living. As always, I welcome the comments, questions and suggestions of members.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Martin.
Thank you, Councillor. Over the last 3.5 months, over 2,232 people have died on this island due to COVID-19. Our first thoughts must be with their families and loved ones, especially those of the 39 people who have passed away since this day last week. The sheer scale and pace of the impact of a pandemic such as this has not been experienced for 100 years, and it continues to impact on nearly every corner of the world. When we look back at the accumulated figures for cases since early March, there is no question that a severe response was required both here and internationally. For the purposes of deciding what we do now and in the coming weeks, the obvious focus has to be on the number of cases which are still active and those who are struggling to overcome the disease. According to yesterday's statistics, in 92% of all positive cases, it has been confirmed that a full recovery has been achieved. Our hospitals are operating well within capacity, and there is no urgent or likely risk that they will be overwhelmed. By every reasonable measure, it has been correct that major elements of the severe lockdown required in March are now being unwound here, just as they have been in most of Europe. However, there are serious issues which we have to address concerning how we move forward and how we tackle the social and economic impact of the pandemic. I think we should acknowledge the concerns raised in the letter published earlier this week from a significant number of scientists about the pace of reopening and their concerns, as well as the clarifications which have come since then and the opposing views which have also been aired. I've often said that it's important that we have challenging voices in this debate. They have urged a level of caution which is unusual in terms of the advice being followed in countries comparable to Ireland. Clearly, this links directly to a concern that people might believe that the threat is over and would allow a significant increase in transmission. The evidence from countries which are far more advanced than Ireland in reopening is that there are two keys to preventing a significant increase in transmission. The first is to do everything possible to reinforce appropriate behaviour, and the second is to be able to rapidly test, trace and isolate when symptoms emerge. My party believes that there is significant work to be done in both areas. As we have been saying for some time, the emphasis in public policy and communication needs to be on more than explaining restrictions. It has to encourage people to act appropriately, irrespective of the level of restrictions. Once people are able to leave their homes, it doesn't matter much how far from their home they are allowed to travel. What matters is how they behave when they travel. We should all be concerned that public perception of how people are complying with restrictions have fallen in recent weeks. It's long past time to require masks in various settings. Both the World Health Organization and the European Centre for Disease Control have said that masks should be used in public transport, shops and similar settings. There is no evidence of masks causing harm and mounting evidence of them preventing the spread of the virus. This is because the masks both physically limit the virus and, crucially, also encourage greater awareness of proper behaviour. I believe the messaging hasn't been clear enough up to now. And let's be clear, the idea that you can only require masks if the state provides them is absurd. They are cheap to make, and every country which introduced rules on face covering has been able to implement them without discrimination and without state schemes. In the weekly research published yesterday, 84% of people said they would wear a face covering if required, but only 28% say that they're using a mask. We also have to be unambiguous in saying that we have the capacity to rapidly test, trace and isolate new cases. While the number of close contacts per case has risen slightly, it is only a small fraction of the figure from March. If we have the proper capacities in place, then we can move forward. I would point out that we still have not received a proper report on estimates of untreated illness and other factors which relate to assessing the impact of restrictions. After 3.5 months, the secondary impacts of the response to the pandemic have started to become clearer and require our attention. Mental health research has shown that up to 1 in 5 people can suffer a significant level of psychological trauma during major emergencies, including pandemics. The Department of Health's weekly research has shown high levels of stress, which is consistent with this. We need an urgent plan for how to increase mental health supports immediately and in the coming months. We also need to move more rapidly to achieve greater clarity on what will happen with schools. In many countries, special needs services have been maintained or have been reopened, and I believe every deputy will understand how the families of children with special needs urgently want a commitment concerning July, and I know that the government and the minister are working on this. Because for these children and their families, the lack of expert and structured supports, which are only available in the school setting, is having a deep impact on them. And they're rightly calling for everything possibly to be done to avoid their children losing over 6 months of essential support. Distance learning is not an option for them. To be fair, many teachers have continued with that since the schools closed. Only the teachers and assistants working in schools really have the expertise that the children require. And I do believe there's a bit more clarity perhaps required. I think the Taoiseach in his speech mentioned we are dependent on teachers and childcare coming forward. I think we'd like to know if there's ongoing engagement with the profession and the likelihood of the services coming together. While this week's loosening of restrictions on some businesses has been very welcome, we need to realise that our businesses, and in particular our small businesses, are caught in their biggest ever crisis. We still have roughly 1 million people receiving some sort of pandemic-related support, and the numbers are coming down exceptionally slowly. In many cases, industries are coming forward with plans for how they can safely reopen, and they are desperate for more urgent engagement with their concerns. Hairdressers are looking throughout Europe at measures which have enabled reopening and want to implement them here. And I think they deserve a comprehensive reply, and I know the government, there's engagement there. And I think the nation awaits with bated breath in terms of the developments there. Some more challenged and can manage it a bit more than others. Our SME sector as a whole needs a systematic plan for how to get back on its feet. Measures announced to date are welcome, but they barely scratched the surface of the challenge of preventing pandemic costs being a millstone around the neck of Irish businesses for years to come. Ultimately, there is a major series of financial, legislative and policy measures required to help us recover from this pandemic. As we saw last week in Germany, the pandemic has changed the basic rules of what level of intervention should be considered and the role of government in leading recovery. Yesterday's childcare measures are welcome, but they may not go far enough. The continuation of the wage subsidy scheme in this sector is an imperative, and protecting the viability of existing childcare providers paramount, particularly so as to enable a full retention of qualified people and childcare workers in the sector itself. Is léir fós go bhfuil géarchéim file ann, mada leis na gnóthaí beaga ar fud na tíre. Tá géará ann plan cuimseach a chur ar fáil dóibh agus gach taíochtas féidir a chóirdóibh. Caithimid bartis airgadis, reachtaíochta agus polisathe a chur a bhaim chun donnaing leis na feibanna atá ag na gnóthaí seo. Tóg mar hampla na grúgarí, tá sa going go bhfuil siad ag dag a bháil leis an rialtas a láthir, tá planana a chun donna món ibre a ríist, agus tá an tír ag feitheamh ar cad a tharlóig. Ireland needs a comprehensive and urgent strategy for recovery, and this is something which will not come while we have a caretaker government and a barely half-functioning parliament. There have been comments in recent days suggesting that even if the majority of members of this House elect a government, it will somehow be a conspiracy against the people. I think the aggressive populist tropes involved in this are not something which can distract us. Mar is léir doing, tá géargá rialtas a chur le chéile sa tír seo agus am an daca seo. Tá feibanna áil mhór amach roing, ní féidir le aine is sin a héine, rialtas le trámlach sa Parliament seo, agus beag an rialtas sin den lachach. Agus tá policy féile ag gach éon grúpa sa Parliament seo, agus is rud ná dúrtha páirtithe éagsúla tacht le chéile ar bhatha le pobl na tíre. My party continues to work with others in urgency and good faith to try and form a government which our country clearly needs. Should a government be agreed, it will have both democratic legitimacy and a democratic imperative to act. We have not even begun the work of recovery. To genuinely move to the next stage of the response to the pandemic and to plan and implement recovery, we need a fully functioning government working collectively and implementing an ambitious plan of recovery. For our part, we will do everything possible to make sure that this happens with genuine urgency and that we begin to show people that our country will recover. Thank you.
And can I begin by remembering every soul lost to this virus, sending sympathies to their families, friends and communities, to extend our solidarity to those who are sick at this time and to wish them a full recovery, and again to acknowledge the heroic efforts of workers on the front line, particularly within our health services. And Count Corlett, today, as we are towards the tail end of Carers Week, I want to particularly acknowledge the work of carers and home carers, people whose effort very quietly carried out has meant that people and families have had some comfort and support in incredibly difficult circumstances. These are people to whom we all owe a huge debt of gratitude. And I sincerely hope that as the crisis abates and as we move back into normality of some sort, that their efforts are continuously acknowledged, because very often they believe that they're left behind and they're forgotten. Taoiseach, I've raised with you on a number of occasions the need for a plan for the provision of childcare. And by a plan, I mean one that's workable, that's realistic and that's sustainable. A plan that meets the real-world needs of children and of parents. A plan formulated through proper consultation with childcare professionals and experts. As we meet today, there is still considerable alarm and stress for parents. There is undoubted confusion and some anger within the childcare sector. And I have to tell you, Taoiseach, that these will not have been changed or abated by your government's very disappointing announcement yesterday. The measures announced yesterday don't constitute a plan. They don't comprise a solution. I think at best they might be described as a stopgap, a makeshift collection of short-term measures that inevitably lead parents and childcare providers back to the very same problems that we face today. Those being a lack of investment, capacity problems, fees so high that they equate to a second mortgage, and of course the precarious work and low pay of childcare workers. So despite all of yesterday's fanfare, the truth is that under your childcare package, many childcare providers will be forced to either close their doors come September, or we will see a situation where parents face another hike in childcare fees. Now, families already struggle with the cost of childcare, and I think we can all agree that another increase would be simply unbearable. Under your plan, many childcare workers may be forced onto the dole. That's the reality, Taoiseach, and it's not fair. In fact, I find it mind-boggling that your government cannot seem to grasp that childcare is absolutely vital to our society and to the building of a modern economy. You see, you can't send thousands of people back to work without an answer to their childcare needs. An hour ago, some of us stood with a large group of women outside the Dáil. These women came seeking the extension of maternity leave for 3 months. It's a common sense proposal. The mothers are concerned about the availability of childcare for their young babies. Indeed, many of them haven't yet had the opportunity to introduce their new arrivals to their wider family circle and indeed to their grandparents. So maternity leave benefit must be extended for mothers whose claim expires in the course of this pandemic. That needs to be part of a plan, and you need to go back to the drawing board, Taoiseach. You need to bring forward a workable, real plan that goes beyond September, and one that will command the confidence of parents and childcare professionals alike. Another area causing deep distress, as you have acknowledged, Taoiseach, for many parents is the matter of educational provision for children with special needs. It's now 2 weeks till July, and still we have an ongoing lack of clarity regarding summer provision. That's quite astonishing. I'm sure, like me, many of you saw the report on RTE last week, and it featured parents frankly at their wits' end, trying to provide round-the-clock care to their children. They very sadly and heartbreakingly described their children as forgotten and left behind, and we know that too many families across the state are in this distressing situation. The development and the progress of these children has been badly affected since school closures. Current siad síos ar a cuid páistí ar nós go bhfuil dearmad déanta orthú agus go bhfuil siad fágtha ar cúl. Fága an umarcha teaghlaí tríd an stáit sa cás seo. Bhí droch thionchar ar Ferbert agus dulcan cinna páistí seo ó dúna a cuid scolanna. One particular parent in this report, Ceann Comhairle, Angelina Hines, described the impact on her daughter Zoe. She says Zoe bites her arm in frustration. She eats her clothes. Her daughter no longer engages, and she's not the child she was 9 weeks ago. She used to be able to spoon feed herself thanks to the very hard work and dedication of her teachers. Now that's stopped entirely. So these children, we all agree, need support. They need their specialised routines, and they need expert care. And so parents and the children need government to act. There are concerns already, even before Minister McHugh has announced his scheme, concerns as to whether or not this scheme will answer problems in respect of protocols, organised transport, and a deep worry surrounding the issue of insurance. Taoiseach, I am at this stage genuinely concerned that your government fails to grasp the enormous strain that parents and families are under. It seems to me that you're content to roll along, providing sticking plaster, half-baked fixes, while parents and families are left in limbo. So here's my questions to you. Will you, Taoiseach, go back and bring forward a real plan? And by that, one I mean that in real terms allows childcare providers to reopen their doors. A plan that ensures the jobs of childcare workers and their incomes, and one that ensures parents can access childcare at affordable rates. Secondly, Taoiseach, will you provide within that plan for the 3-month extension to maternity leave? And thirdly, can you tell us that the scheme to be announced tomorrow for summer provision will answer the concerns around protocols, transport and the issue of insurance?
I appreciate what you're saying, that there are concerns about how the summer programme is going to work. And as you said, these concerns exist before the announcement has been made. So I would anticipate and hope that should Minister McHugh and Minister Harris get approval for the summer programme tomorrow, that they will be able to answer questions and allay any concerns that people have tomorrow. But in fairness to them, they can't do that until they actually have government and cabinet approval for the summer programme. In relation to childcare, we have a good plan in place. It's been largely well received, not universally well received, but largely well received, and that will facilitate the reopening of childcare centres for the months of July and August. There's a reopening grant, there's capital grants to carry out works to childcare centres, and there's also a wage subsidy, the government paying roughly 70% of the wages in the sector during that period. I agree that a longer term plan will be needed to apply from September onwards, but it's our view that, at least as of now, that should be a matter for the new government. And I know there are discussions about childcare among the parties willing to form a government. Your party has given up on any attempt to form a government. You won't have a say in that or a role in that, but obviously the parties forming a government will, and will of course consult with the sector as they should. In relation to issues around maternity leave and maternity benefit, we're happy to consider any proposals being made. In your initial contribution you said maternity benefit. Later on you said maternity leave. They're not the same thing. And obviously paternity benefit, paternity leave and parental leave and parental benefit would have to come into the mix as well, because sometimes, not commonly, but sometimes the man is the main carer in a one-parent family as well. But if you have proposals that are comprehensive, we'd be very happy to examine them.
Just to say to you, in the limited time available, a petition has been signed by some 25,000 people, men and women, looking for an extension to the maternity benefit and leave associated with that benefit. And I would urge you to consider this and to deliver on this very quickly. It's just plain common sense. If you think about it for a second, bringing home a newborn in these circumstances, isolated from family, all of the concerns that emerge in that scenario, and then the concern as to whether or not very young children, babies, will in fact be able to access childcare places. So I want to press you on that and ask you to bring that forward. Your childcare plan isn't a proper plan. I've made that point to you. I'm disappointed that on reflection you can't see that as a very obvious fact. And thirdly, on the issue of special provision, just bear in mind there was to be a scheme involving SNAs and supports for these children and families weeks ago, and that came to nothing. I am appealing to you, Taoiseach, not to disappoint these families and children again. They are in dire straits. They need a scheme that they can really access, and one that delivers the real supports that these families desperately need. So I hope tomorrow the scheme, as announced, will answer the concerns that I've raised and many others.
Thank you very much indeed, Cloncorla. 2 days ago, Taoiseach, George Floyd was buried, and our thoughts and prayers were with his family and the African-American people who have been under that knee of suppression for so long. Aresh Day, Garevan and Dáil. And that Black Lives Matter movement is continuing and strengthening and correctly building a community response to what needs to be done in the States. But I think we'd all agree that our support for that is best reflected on what we do in countering the issue of racism in our own country. And Taoiseach, I was glad to see yesterday you had an online meeting with Irish people of colour to talk about how we use this special moment to eliminate racism in our own country. And I want to ask you maybe just some thoughts, or your thoughts, on what specifically we can do in that regard. It was interesting today, reading the newspapers, relevant articles. There was a story about the Lekela School in Tyrrellstown. Good story in a sense about integration, a young black Irish teacher showing how it can be done, how we can integrate and actually rid ourselves of this scourge. But the statistics were interesting. 1 in 10 of our children from non-Irish or new Irish backgrounds, but only 1 in 20 of our teachers. And I think any of us know in our own constituencies, it tends to be certain schools is where all the, increasingly, we've segregation in our school system, where certain schools take all the new community and other schools have pretty much none. So should we not commit, if we're serious on this issue, to make sure our education system is fully integrated? We don't have such segregation and separation as we start off in life within our school system. Is that not one thing we could commit to try and do? It was interesting, and again in the newspaper today, there was a young Irishman, Sean Gallan, giving his experience of being othered, of being from the age of 6, being given that name, you nigger, and explained that sense of how it completely undermines people, and every people I know, friends and relations of colour in this country, and travellers and other minorities, speak of the same experience. It's real. If you look in the policing of that, again, it's interesting. We have to make sure that our policing, as it changes now, the future policing evolves, that it is blind to the issue of colour or ethnicity or indeed postcode, where you might come from. But again, if you look at the statistics, 1 in 10 new Irish, but only 1 in 200 of the Garda Síochána come from new Irish ethnic backgrounds. So that's a second maybe thing we could commit to changing, to making sure that our society is managed, that we don't fall foul and continue to fall foul of the lack of security for all our people in our country. Thirdly, Taoiseach, and I think we are hopefully coming to really address this, the issue of how we treat those who are most vulnerable, as people seeking asylum and refuge here, that we have to immediately end the provisions where we are putting those people in conditions, in direct provision, which fundamentally undermines their mental health and their ability to make this country, if they are approved to stay here, their home. That the way we're doing things is fundamentally undermining their health, and that has to stop and that has to change. And I welcome the sense I have from parties across this House that that's something that we're all committed to doing, to be the very best we can in accepting and welcoming asylum seekers to our country, acting quickly in terms of deciding what their status is, but also treating them with real care and respect while they're here and when and if they stay. Fourthly, and just in terms of what we can do, and this is probably the most complex, is the issue about how we manage online communications where some of the overt racism and extremism, we all aware of it here as politicians, we see the certain strands of it, but to be honest, not the worst. And we have a special responsibility because we're home, our European headquarters, European, Middle East and Africa, MEA headquarters for most of the social platforms, where a lot of this hate speech is now evolving, racist often in tone, terrifying. And how we manage that, how we work with the companies, which we have to do, to make sure that they have duty of care stitched into their very business models. So it's not just kind of impossible to police every single online communication on every single social media network, but that the business models, the regulatory systems, the ethos and the ethics, as well as the rules and the punitive measures are in place to make sure that we don't see what has been a characteristic of these online platforms, further division and derision as becoming acceptable everyday part of our lives. And lastly, and I'll give you as much time, Taoiseach, as I can because I'm keen to hear your views, do we not need to make sure that we as a country see the maxim that my security is maximised when my neighbour's security is protected too? And that their security is best guaranteed when prosperity is shared across this country. That we aim or set ourselves the target, the country with the least divergence in wealth and income as best we can, Because I think that is often sometimes behind. If you look at what is the source and root and fear of these racist tendencies and instincts, it is sometimes communities that feel that they are being left behind, and that breeds resentment and fear of the other, fear of the new. And indeed, for new communities coming in, we have to make sure that they can get the leg up and they're not on a kind of a separate economy, the black economy literally, where they're not paid properly and the working conditions are not as good. We will manage this issue about tackling racism best if we create a social justice economy which actually guarantees everyone's security and prosperity, and in that we remove the scourge of othering and of that basic divergence in racism, which exists in our country. Let's not pretend it doesn't, but it's our job to try and help remove. I'm interested to hear what your conversation, how it went yesterday, and if you agree with those sort of measures.
Thanks very much, contribution. I think we all agree and accept and understand that racism exists in every society. It takes different forms, but that makes it no less real. And sadly, Ireland is by no means immune to the scourge of racism. Had a very good engagement yesterday, which you mentioned, with Irish people who are black and Irish people who are of colour. A Zoom call went on for over an hour, really to hear from them and to share our collective experiences of racism in Ireland. And among the kind of things that came up as ideas that we might pursue, one certainly is around education, making sure that we educate children better in schools and throughout the educational cycle about racism, about what it is, how to identify it and how to deal with it. And one thing that I thought was interesting from the conversation is that a lot of the education that we now have around racism is telling people what not to say. Don't use this word, don't use that name, don't say this. But actually a lot of people feel that to be disabling. They don't know what they should say. How do we talk about the elephant in the room, which may be race? So I think that's part of what we have to do. Secondly, we do need a reform of our incitement to hatred laws. That work has started already by the outgoing government. I hope it will be completed by the next one to modernise our hate speech and hate crime laws. Again, work underway that needs to be completed by the next government is the creation of an online safety commissioner and a proper infrastructure legally underpinned to require social media platforms to take down things that are racist or offensive or incite violence or hatred in any way. One thing I strongly agree with the Deputy on is the need to set a target to have a number of people from ethnic minorities in areas of the public service. We have a health service that's very diverse, although less so as you go up towards the senior positions, not so much in the Gardaí, not so much in the Defence Forces, not so much in the education sector, as the Deputy mentioned, not at all in the civil service, which is very white, including the Department of Equality, for example. And that actually needs to change. So we need to have, I think, a target for people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds, but also dedicated recruitment campaigns to encourage people, because we do need a generation of young people growing up in Ireland who are people of colour to see black and brown school principals, judges, Cian Corla perhaps in the future. Who knows? Visibility and opportunity is really important. Finally, on direct provision accommodation centres, as I've said in the House before, I agree that much of it is substandard, the accommodation, and that needs to change. I don't think it'd be honest to say that we can immediately end it, and we need to be honest about that. It's around for 20 years, 9 years under my party, 4 years under the Green Party, let's not forget. And if we could provide own-door self-catering accommodation to 7,000 people tomorrow, we probably would, but we can't. And we don't also know how many will come in this year and next year and other years, but I do think we should try to phase it out. Briefly on income inequality, and that can drive racism, I agree with that. That we're one of the few countries in recent years that has actually reduced income inequality. We should be proud of having achieved that as a country. Poverty has fallen every year for the past 5 years, so has deprivation. That needs to continue, and as we've demonstrated in the past 5 years, the best way to reduce poverty and to reduce income inequality is job creation and opportunity. And that's what needs to be reinforced, that we don't go backwards in terms of our commitment to job creation and providing people with opportunities to advance themselves.
Thank you, Conor. I just again want to state my show of solidarity for all the workers out there who are doing such amazing jobs. I witnessed it again very directly this week, and our condolences to all of those who've lost loved ones. Taoiseach, I have 6 questions. Some of them are pretty quick answers, I would say, so I'll put them to you and give you time to answer. I want to start by actually complimenting you, which is kind of rare in this House. It's not always that governments listen to opposition and take on board what they're saying, but I have seen evidence, whether it is directly in here or through committees or through direct conversations with some ministers, and I say some in inverted commas, that suggestions have been put forward and have been taken on board. So I welcome that. Some time ago I suggested that the phasing should be brought down from 5 to 4, and you announced that last week, so I welcome that too. I also believe that the roadmap which my former employers in Fáilte Ireland brought out during the week, to be fair, they made a good stab at it. It's not their fault, but it's unimplementable and not viable for most businesses. Tens of thousands of people are depending on that changing by the 29th. It all hangs around the 2 metre, 1 metre distance. And if we are going where we're going with the virus, thanks to all the work, I would encourage you to announce that in advance to give them time. Same with personal services as regards hairdressing and everything. I believe that we're very much dependent on the 2 metres to 1 metre in relation to that whole sector, that whole industry, the tourism industry, hospitality industry. So I would encourage you to do so and give them time to prepare. So that's my first question, but you just consider that. Second, while you're in the listening mode, 2 more questions. Flu vaccine. I've asked this before. I'm strongly encouraging you and asking you to consider, that's all I'm doing is asking you to consider, that in the coming calendar year, this may be for 2 years, but particularly as a one-off for this year coming, that we give the flu vaccine to everybody for free. It's working out at about 10 million per 500,000 people extra. It would depend on how many people take it up. Obviously, we need to ensure that those working professionally in the health service need to take the flu vaccine. We can't face into the flu vaccine and the COVID situation potentially together. So please I'd be happy enough if you consider it. I think everybody in the House would support this. I don't think, I think it's just common sense. So I would encourage you to do so. Also, in relation to face masks, it's been a disaster, absolute chronic disaster, the commentary coming out of it, whether it was NEFIT, whether it was all the various different very eminent people who are experts in disease control, etc., but it's been a disaster. And my colleague Duncan Smith has raised the issue of giving communication to everybody in the country, and I believe you should do that too. Workers need to be respected. Nobody should be getting on public transport without a mask now, full stop. In retail, people should be wearing masks. Protect the workers. They deserve respect and to be protected. So once-off communication to everybody in the country with samples or examples of masks. In Catalonia, everyone in the pharmacy can get one for free, and then they can buy one for less than €1 on top of that. So please consider that too. In relation to the health service in general, last week you said that the board of the HSE would be passing the new plan for non-COVID healthcare, which I've been raising here now for 5 to 6 weeks. We still don't have a plan, Taoiseach. It's not acceptable. This is actually the biggest issue in our country at the moment. Ireland thinks, as pointed out, that 1 in 3 people are not going to appointments, are not going to the doctor until a point after they feel they can in relation to COVID. So where is it? And is the issue that the parameters being set by NEFIT because of the 2 metre, 1 metre thing are actually so strict that they don't want to publish a plan because actually it would cause a crisis in healthcare because it would show them in a demonstrable way the amount of appointments that actually now will be dropped. The percentages of people that can go will be so low because of the 2 metre, 1 metre change or non-change. Is that the reason? In relation to in relation to cancer screening, Dr. Doireann O'Leary from Cork was on to me, and she's aghast as to why we're not doing screening. GP services are operating. They can easily send on smears, for example. So where is the plan in relation to this? We've spent years fighting, saying screening saves lives. All of a sudden now, it's not saving lives at the moment, and there isn't an urgency about it. So I would really ask you, Taoiseach, to answer that. 2 last quick questions. What's your personal view as regards maintaining the Department of Children? Do you believe, as the Taoiseach, we should have a Department of Children? And very last question, and I know you can't fully answer this, Taoiseach, but I do want your opinion. There's an individual from our country who has, according to the High Court, is a very senior figure in organised crime on a global scale, and according to CAB, has controlled and managed operations of the Kenyan organised crime group for some time. He's now rebranding himself in the Middle East as a boxing promoter, and one of the most famous individuals involved in that has described him as a smart, able and honest man. Taoiseach, our country has to intervene here. We have to, through the Department of Foreign Affairs, intervene with the UAE in relation to this individual. We owe it to the victims of such a cartel. Our country needs to do this and needs to do it today. We also need to communicate very strongly with certain sports broadcasters and certain sports companies and other companies involved in this. This is an important juncture, Taoiseach, and I would ask you, through the Department of Foreign Affairs, through the Minister for Foreign Affairs, to highlight how important this is for us because of the parasitical criminal activities of this individual and all associated with him. Thank you.
Thanks, Deputy, and thanks for raising that matter. I don't want to say too much about it, but I have to say I was rather taken aback to see Tyson Fury and his video the other day, and just dropping in that name that you mentioned, as if this was not somebody who has quite a checkered history in this state and elsewhere. And while I can't comment on any particular Garda operation, I can certainly assure you that there has been contact between the Department of Foreign Affairs and the authorities in the United Arab Emirates about that matter. In relation to the 2 metre, 1 metre issue, I think, as I mentioned before, everyone acknowledges that 2 metres is better than 1. 1 metre or more gives you about 70% protection, closer to 95% when you go to 2. But we also appreciate that there are certain circumstances where that may not be viable. And particularly when the virus is now so successfully suppressed in our community, it does allow us to re-examine that. And NEFID is doing some work on that in consultation with us now. On the flu vaccine, the Minister for Health has already announced the biggest expansion ever of the flu vaccine programme. Children will get it this autumn, for example, many more vulnerable groups, and we will consider the Deputy's proposal of making it universal. I haven't seen the merits and demerits of that, but it's something we're considering. On face masks and face coverings, I think the advice is very simple. The advice is that you should wear a face mask or a face covering when you're using public transport or when you're in a crowded indoor place, like a supermarket, for example. You should be aware that it's not a magic shield. It's not an alternative to physical distancing or hand washing or any of those other things, but it can help in terms of additionality, and you should wear it properly. Wash your hands before you put it on, cover your nose and mouth, and don't wear it around your neck like a scarf. It's a mask. So I think we will need to launch a new public information campaign to reinforce that even more. But there were, only in the last few days, revised guidelines from the WHO, so we want to make sure that we go out there with a public information campaign that then doesn't change in a week or two when new advice arrives. So we want to get it right. My understanding from the Minister for Health is that screening will resume over the summer, starting with smear taking and cervical screening, but that is not yet confirmed, but that's certainly the intention. And finally, on the Department of Children, this is a department that was established by my party and indeed yours when we formed the government in 2011. It has been a positive and progressive development, ensured that the rights of children are now enshrined in the Constitution. Mandatory reporting became a reality. TUSLA was established, and also the National Childcare Scheme was implemented. So I think it has been a good thing that we've had a Department of Children. I do also bear in mind, though, that any time you create a new department, it comes at a cost. And the Department of Defence ceased to be a standalone department as a consequence, and the Community, Rural and Gaeltacht department disappeared. And there were negative consequences to that. So one of the constraints that anybody works under our constitution is you can have any number of departments, but you can only have 15 senior ministers, and it's pretty meaningless to call for a new department to be created or for a department to be retained if you don't say which 15 you want, because then you're not being entirely honest with people. So I always call on anyone looking for a new department to say which one they want to be merged or abolished, and the same applies the other way around too.
Thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Catherine Murphy.
Thank you. Taoiseach, as we proceed through the accelerated roadmap and people begin to look towards normal life, or as normal as it can be, summer holidays and travel become a big focus of that. In the sea of what has been confusing messaging on a host of measures, not least face coverings, Andrew, you've addressed that to some degree now, it's fair to say that people are also confused about the realistic prospect of air travel or not in the near future. Michael O'Leary has been omnipresent, telling everyone who listened that Ryanair have everything sorted and are restoring 40% of their flights from the 1st of July. They're proudly announcing on their website that travel restrictions are lifted and they're open for holidays from $39.99. Yet, I had a good look at the website and nowhere does it reference our own government restrictions which have been imposed regarding the need to self-isolate for 2 weeks upon landing, or the fact that we now have a mandatory form to complete, that you would give an address that you may be contacted at. I think we have to be realistic in suggesting that someone who goes off on a week's holiday, are they really going to take 3 weeks off and isolate themselves for 2 weeks and not return to work? Similarly, someone on a business trip for a few days, I think we have to be realistic about this. From July the 1st, the scale of this issue becomes much bigger. I think we'll all agree that had travel restrictions been in place in March, when we had a large influx of visitors from northern Italy, we may have had a considerably reduced number of infections, and indeed we may well have had avoidable deaths. The aim of the roadmap is to reopen as much as possible, as soon as possible, as safely as possible, and that's fine. But a quick, reliable method of testing and tracing becomes critically important in not regressing. So we need to carefully manage risk, and travel is one of the main risks. We were told last week in this House by the Minister for Transport that social distancing will occur on airlines where possible. Where possible could mean limiting the number of passengers or separating people where the flights are not fully booked, but where they are fully booked. But ultimately, who decides that and how is it policed? Are we happy that those decisions are being made by a particular airline? Or are there plans have the government plans to manage this? Michael O'Leary's business is flying people and making a profit. Our business is about keeping people safe. The two are not necessarily in keeping with one another. The fact is that we cannot be complacent about the potential growth of the virus becoming a resurgent. In the US, for example, just 6 weeks ago, there were 7 states where the R number was greater than 1. Today, there's 15 states where the R number is greater than 1, and that signals that the virus is expanding. In Britain, the UK top government scientists appear to acknowledge, at least in private, that the R number appears to be above 1. But there's daily flights being advertised from the 1st of July to London, Birmingham, Manchester and many other UK destinations. With a small number of flights, it's possible to test and trace, but if that's scaled up dramatically, then it requires a significantly scaled up testing and tracing operation. And who's going to do that? Is that being planned for? When it comes to testing at airports, bear in mind that hospitals do tests and give results within 10 minutes from start to finish. Is that an option? And if so, is that being used? Could that not be used in other settings? Is it cost? Is it tests? I wonder, is it about reliability when hospitals see them as reliable tests? There's talk of air corridors, and there's also, places and locations where testing is done in airports. So what is the approach? In addition to the confusion about face coverings, although that seems to be fairly clear in relation to air travel, we're being told that they're going to be mandatory on flights. But how is that going to be policed? There's nervous flyers, there's, you know, children on flights and things like that. It's very mixed messages. So we know that the ideal would be to eliminate the virus, but failing that, the best we can do is to manage it and keep it to an absolute minimum. So, Taoiseach, travel is such an important part of that, and our airlines are a really important industry, and I want to acknowledge that, but they have to operate safely. So who is making the decision on this, Taoiseach? Is it being made by the airline? Or is the government having a role? Is the government, policing this? And how is it going to be managed? And will you tell us, with increased flights, how is it intended to manage the risks? Is that going to be scaled up? Who's going to do it? Is it not also self-evident that testing at airports and ports is going to have to happen?
Thanks, Deputy. To answer your question, decisions will be made by government, not by individual airlines. But the decisions we made will, of course, be coordinated with the European Commission and also EASA, the European Air Safety Authority. And we do need to bear in mind that we are all EU citizens, and EU citizens have the freedom to travel, work and study anywhere in the European Union. We can bring in limitations based on public health, but they have to be justified. In terms of foreign travel, and by foreign travel I mean travel off the island of Ireland, our advice is that people should not engage in any unnecessary travel. And I think the message is clear. It's there anytime you turn on the TV. Stay local. Don't leave your county, or don't go more than 20 kilometres from your home unless you have to. So that certainly says don't travel abroad. Anyone entering the country to our ports and airports has to sign a passenger locator form. It is an offence to fill it in falsely, and people are then strongly advised to self-isolate for 14 days. The plan is to establish air bridges with other countries that have a similar level of viral suppression. We haven't agreed any of them yet, but that is the plan. In terms of testing at airports and ports, consideration is being given to that, but there are real limitations. First, there is the cost of the test, which is not low. Secondly, there is the inevitability of false negatives. People in the early stages of the disease may not test positive, but may be spreading it within days. And then there's also the fact that a 14-day self-isolation is still the safer option.
The advice we heard last week from the Minister for Transport that the social distancing on flights would occur where possible. Is there limits on the number of people that are allowed to board a flight? And if not, is it really possible if the flight is full? Because we saw a number of weeks ago, we saw an Aer Lingus flight from Belfast, and we saw photographs of that at the height of the pandemic here, and that's the kind of thing that we're likely to see. Look, the thing about it is that we all want the least amount of restriction, but there has to be where there's so much effort has been put in from people, not least frontline workers, people who have cocooned for months. We can't ignore the risks from particular locations where the R number is high. And that has to be managed. And it doesn't feel to me where you turn on the radio and you hear the advertisement almost on the same group of advertisements about the government restrictions. But we've got to remember that flights go in two directions, and there will be people coming to this country from locations where there is a higher rate of infection than there is here. And it's how that's managed that is critically important. And can you tell us about the scaling up of the testing and tracing in the context of an increased number of people who are coming into this country by airports and ferry ports?
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Conclude, please.
Thanks. Like we have very considerable testing and tracing capacity now. The capacity to test 100,000 people a week and to trace many thousands of people. It's not being used at the moment because of the low level of demand for it, but it can be used if we need to do so in the future. And that's really going to be the future, is making sure that we have a very strong testing and tracing capacity, so that any imported cases and any new clusters are identified quickly and can be stamped on quickly, so that they don't spread and so that we don't have to engage in any more lockdowns. I think what the Deputy says is absolutely correct. Social distancing on planes, and not just in planes, in airports, would be extremely difficult to achieve. So that's another place where you're probably going to be into advising people to wear masks, because social distancing won't be practical. In terms of air bridges, we don't have any yet, so that's why we're advising people not to come here and not to fly out of the country. But just giving an idea of the kind of countries where there's a similar number of low cases as us, 16 in Ireland yesterday, Finland 15, Greece 10. Countries like that, the number of new cases is very low, and therefore the risk of journeys between those countries would be very low. But it can change quickly. We thought Portugal was one of them, and there were, I think, 400 cases in Portugal yesterday. So it's a changing picture even still.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. We move now to Deputy Breed-Smith, sharing with Deputy Murphy.
Sinead, Gurmagat Ceann Comhairle. I want to start by offering our solidarity to all those who've lost and suffered during this pandemic, and indeed all those who've lost their jobs. And in particular, I want to give a shout out for the thousands of Debenham workers who are protesting outside closed stores today. We should remember the impact on their lives as well. Taoiseach, I've something to give you, so chalk it up. It's not often you'll get anything from me, but I will leave it at the desk in front of the Ceann Comhairle for you to collect. It's a petition of over 25,000 of our citizens who are calling for the extension of maternity leave and benefit for women who are currently on maternity leave. And as was mentioned earlier, we met them outside the Dáil this morning. They handed over this petition. I want to thank those new mothers for the work they've put into it. I want to thank Uplift and the National Women's Council for supporting them. And I don't have to tell you, I'm sure as a doctor you'd understand the stress and anxiety that new mothers face having to return to work in normal circumstances. In these circumstances, that stress and anxiety is enormous. And they also face the possibility of having absolutely no childcare, no option of being able to rely on their families. I've brought this issue up with the Minister for Finance, the Minister for Justice, the Minister for Social Protection, and it seems to me that this is a parcel that's getting kicked around the place, so I really welcome the opportunity to address you on this. And I want to say before you answer me that I don't accept the excuse of it requiring primary legislation before it can be done. I very much welcome the extension of the wage subsidy scheme to those on maternity leave that was introduced just over a week ago in this House, or maybe it's 2 weeks ago now. But what that requires is retrospective legislation, and the same can be done with this. I don't accept that we can't do it. And what I'd like to say is that for the cost that Regina Doherty gave me, which is 134 million, to extend this for 3 months to all those mothers who would be entitled to it, is a pittance compared to what we have paid out, compared to what we're prepared to pay out to industry, compared to what we normally pay out to industries like greyhound and horse racing industries. I believe that these mothers and their babies are worth it, well worth it in terms of their contribution to society, and that this move would be a brave move by you, Taoiseach. You can do it. There's a similar campaign in Britain, and you could give a lead on this. And I just want to really ask you, do you have the political will to make sure that this happens and that legislation can be introduced retrospectively, rather than having the stress, anxiety and worry put upon these families, that you would allow them to stay on maternity leave with the benefits for the extra 3 months? Remember, many of these new mothers are lone parents also, and they really do need the finance that goes with the extended leave. It's not a question of taking unpaid leave or relying on parental leave. They need to be made a special case of during the COVID crisis. And any excuse about legislation is just unacceptable. We've extended and changed legislation in relation to evictions, planning laws, labour laws, employment laws. This can be done for the mothers and children of this country who are worth every penny and every move that you can make.
Thank you, Deputy Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy, and thanks for bringing the petition. I will give it consideration, and I mean that. Meaningful and full consideration over the next couple of days. A lot of the legislation that you mentioned earlier that was done when we had a properly constituted Senate, which we don't have now, so we're not in a position to enact primary legislation, and it may require it, and you can't always bring in retrospective legislation. The leave aspect would be justice legislation, the benefit aspect would be social protection legislation, but we will give it due consideration, and I'm aware of the strength of feeling behind the campaign, and I can certainly see the benefits in extending maternity leave and maternity benefit for families who've had a newborn in the last couple of weeks or couple of months. I did read today in the newspapers. I'm always nervous of reading stories in the newspapers that relate to a scientific paper because often they're not reported correctly. But I did read a story in the papers today which was interesting, actually, showing that there had been a significant decrease in the number of low birth weight babies born in, say, Munchin's Maternity Hospital in Limerick. And that was really interesting because one of the worries we had a few weeks and a few months ago was that the increased stress and anxiety during this period might actually have negative health impacts, and I think it has. But this has actually been a silver lining one, if you like, a positive health impact, whereby it seems that the lockdown has resulted in a different lifestyle, which has resulted in fewer low birth babies being born, which is really significant, but only one study. Wouldn't want to read too much into it, but
Thank you,
it is interesting.
Deputy Paul Murphy.
Thanks, Chairman Corla. Taoiseach, last week you told the Dáil that as a result of your proposed cuts to the pandemic unemployment payment of €350, nobody would be worse off than they were before the pandemic. That isn't true, Taoiseach, is it? You have played with words in order to hide the reality of the cuts that you are planning. But the department's press statement last Friday and updated today is clear. It says, quote, for those whose prior employment earnings were up to €199.99 per week, the PUP rate would be €203 per week. What that means is huge cuts in income for many lone parents and others who had part-time jobs bringing in under €200 a week, but also had income from social welfare. Those hard-pressed families will end up substantially worse off, some losing almost half their income, adding to the horrific increases in food poverty reported today. I'll give you a couple of examples. Emma was working 2 days a week for 8 hours on €12 an hour and has one child. She was previously earning €192 a week from her job and got €225.50 per week in job seekers transitional payment. So her total weekly income was €17.50 a week. When she lost her job due to the pandemic, this was reduced to €350 on the PUP. From the end of June, however, her PUP will be cut to €203, and she'll have to move back to the job seekers transitional payment and will therefore be will be reduced to €239, a drop from €401 a week to €239. A cruel cut that will mean that she can't afford to pay her rent through no fault of her own. Take John, who was previously working 2 days a week on minimum wage, earning €161.60 a week. He was also getting €130 in job seekers allowance for the 3 days a week he wasn't working. His total income was just over €290. Now you're cutting him to €203, a drop of his income of about a third. There's many, many more examples that could be given, including students who work part-time in January and February, full-time at this time of year, and rely on that income to pay their way through college, seasonal workers who work part-time in the off-season through no choice of their own and rely on the income that they make in the summer working full-time. Taoiseach, will you correct the record, accept that many people will be worse off if you proceed with the cut to the pandemic unemployment payment, and will you therefore agree to withdraw the cut?
Thanks, Deputy. I'd have to examine the individual examples that you give, but what I said was that nobody would be worse off than they were before the pandemic as a consequence of the decision being made. I didn't say that nobody would be worse off than they were before the pandemic. Lots of people are worse off than they were before the pandemic. Anyone who was earning, anyone who's lost their job, for example, or most people who've lost their jobs, sadly are worse off than they were before the pandemic, because the average weekly wage in Ireland in the first quarter of this year was €800 a week. We were seeing some very significant real and welcome wage growth in Ireland before the pandemic, up to €800 a week. So that average person who was earning €800 a week who lost their job is now on €350 a week. So yes, lots of people are much worse off than they were before the pandemic hit, and that would be true of people on the wage subsidy as well. The solution isn't welfare, the solution is jobs, getting people back to work and into work so they can earn much more than ever can be offered in the welfare system. There are people who were on the pandemic unemployment payment who would be better off on regular welfare payments. For example, the one parent family payment, job seekers, particularly if they have dependents, and the option is there for them to apply for that.
Taoiseach, I'll quote your words from last week in the Dáil. The changes we are making tomorrow will ensure that those young people, referring to young people who have been working part-time before the crisis, those young people are no worse off than they were before the pandemic. That is the impression that you gave people. You suggested that those people would not lose out as a result of your cuts, and that's not the truth. The truth is a lot of people are going to be worse off as a consequence of your government decision. Some people will lose up to 50% of their income. An incredibly cruel cut for you to be making, particularly in terms of the context of food poverty and everything else. This is in line with your kicking down with the welfare cheats cheat us all based on bogus figures, based on spin. It's right populism, going after bogeymen of people who supposedly won the lotto, who obviously haven't, preparing the way to cut PUP for everybody. You should withdraw the cut, Taoiseach.
I don't have the full transcript in front of me, but I think, if I remember correctly, you were specifically referring to students and young people working part-time, not the kind of examples that you gave there. On the welfare system, we have the same welfare system as we had before the pandemic. Internationally and independently adjudicated to be one of the more generous welfare systems in the world, and one of the welfare systems in the world that is most successful at redistributing income. That welfare system has not been cut. We layered on top of that something new, which was the pandemic unemployment payment.
All right, thank you, Taoiseach. Deputy Noel Grealish.
Taoiseach, the tremendous sacrifice of the average people over the past few months has meant that we as a nation have made great progress in flattening the curve. Again, I would like to pay a tribute to the frontline staff who have done Trojan work over the past few months dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. These people put their own lives at risk to care for the sick and to get us where we are today. Unfortunately, some frontline staff lost their lives, and I would like to offer my condolences to their families and to the families of all those who have lost a loved one due to the coronavirus. And I would like to congratulate you, Taoiseach, and your government, and all who have played a part in flattening the curve over the past few months. Taoiseach, I have a number of issues I would like to raise with you today. Firstly, parents of children with severe and profound disabilities still have no certainty regarding a return to education for their children. These children who thrive and progress in the school environment have now been at home for 13 weeks. Distance learning is not an option, and unfortunately many of these children have regressed in terms of their education and behaviour since the lockdown began. Life has been extremely difficult for the parents that time, and they have advocated for the July provision to take place in a school-based setting. I know that the July education programme was debated with the Minister for Education, Joe McHugh, in the Chamber yesterday, and he stated that the issue will be discussed at the Cabinet meeting Friday and that he would give an update following that meeting. I am aware of schools in Galway that are ready to open for the scheme, but they have not received any communication from the Department of Education. Special needs schools are very different to mainstream schools. They operate in small numbers, and staff already practice infection control protocols, and they are also responsible for care and hygiene for the children. So in many ways they are amongst the best placed schools ready to reopen. Parents of these children need a firm commitment on a date that schools will reopen, and I ask Taoiseach that a firm commitment will be given after Friday's Cabinet meeting. Taoiseach, businesses have just started to reopen and will need support for the weeks and months ahead. These businesses need short-term and direct financial support, and also long-term access to low-cost capital. When businesses closed their doors, many, especially those in tourism and the hospitality sector, lost their cash flow immediately. These were viable businesses which were trading successfully, and it is absolutely critical that we get businesses back up and running again. The SME sector employs almost 1 million people in Ireland. The hospitality sector employs over 260,000 people, with 27,000 in Galway alone. Tourism will be the last industry to recover, putting thousands of jobs at risk. Taoiseach, it is reported in today's Irish Independent that foreign visitors to Ireland will be down by 10 million this year. If each of these tourists spent an average of €1,000, this is a loss of 10 billion to the Irish economy, particularly the hospitality sector. In Galway alone, we're down over 200 million in lost revenue with the cancellation of the Galway Races, the Arts Festival and the cancellation of all events relating to the European Capital of Culture 2020. And Taoiseach, I would like to compliment Galway 2020 CEO Patricia Philbin and all our staff for the excellent work that they had done in preparing for Galway 2020, which unfortunately had to be cancelled. Taoiseach, I believe the following measures should be considered to kickstart the SME and especially the hospitality sector. I would ask for the suspension of all rates for a 12-month period, not a deferral, a zero VAT rate to overcome challenges in the short term and to help businesses get up and running more quickly, and a return to the 9% VAT rate for the hospitality sector up to the end of the 2022 season. Taoiseach, NAMA was established in 2009 to bail out the banks and ultimately to save the Irish economy. I believe something similar needs to be done now to keep businesses viable until a vaccine becomes widely available and businesses can operate with normal capacity and tourists can travel freely. Irish businesses and the Irish taxpayer bailed out banks at a cost of more than €100 billion, and it's now time for the SME and hospitality sector to be supported to get our economy back on track. If these businesses cannot reopen due to cash flow problems, many thousands of people will be out of work in the long term. Also, Taoiseach, in relation to the hotel and tourism industry, the timing of the lockdown in the middle of March coincided with the start of the tourism season, meaning that many of the regular summer staff were not on the payroll on the 29th of February and hence they could not avail of the wage subsidy scheme. I would ask that this situation be examined to see what support or grant scheme can be put in place to help seasonal business to rehire their staff. Taoiseach, another huge issue, and it was raised here already, for the hospitality sector is the 2-metre social distancing rule. According to all media reports, if this rule is left in place, 84,000 fewer jobs will be filled in the hospitality sector. It will have a devastating impact on many businesses which will not be able to open. Taoiseach, earlier this week I met with a number of local hoteliers from across Galway City and County who employ thousands of people. The 2-metre social distancing rule was one of the biggest issues of concern. These businesses are now actively preparing for reopening, and if the 2-metre rule is going to change, a decision needs to be made quickly before money is spent renovating and preparing for 2 metres social distancing. These businesses don't have the cash flow to change the premises around again if social distancing is reduced from 2 metres to 1 metre in a couple of weeks' time. I know, Taoiseach, that you take your advice from the medical experts, but I would ask that you please consider reducing the social distancing rule from 2 metres to 1 metre, which is in line with the World Health Organization guidelines and similar to what has been implemented in other European countries. In summary, Taoiseach, my questions to you are the following. After Friday's Cabinet meeting, will a firm commitment be given on a reopening date for special schools so that they can operate the July provision programme in a school-based setting for children with severe and profound disabilities? In relation to businesses, can commercial rates and VAT rates be suspended with a view to kick-starting our economy and getting businesses up and running again? Can a scheme similar to the wage subsidy scheme be introduced for seasonal workers in the hospitality sector to help retain their employment? And finally, Taoiseach, can the 2 metre social distancing rule be reduced to 1 metre in line with the World Health Organization guidelines?
Thanks, Deputy. I answered questions earlier on the 2 metre rule, so I might answer other questions now. In terms of the summer programme, the plan, at least, or the plan as of now, is that Ministers Harris and McHugh will bring their proposals to Cabinet tomorrow. All things going to plan, we'll sign off on that tomorrow, and they'll make the announcement, and hopefully that will answer any questions or allay any concerns that people have. And I absolutely understand the stress that parents with children who have special needs are under at the moment. Spoke to some of them very much at the end of their tether, and we've been working really hard for the last couple of weeks to put something in place so that they do get the education and stimulation that they need over the summer period, both home-based and school-based. So that's what we're working towards. On Galway 2020, really want to share Deputy Grealish's words about that. I don't think anybody could have endured so much bad luck as Galway 2020 has. It was going to be great. I was really excited about it. Government was very happy to support it financially. Couldn't do the launch because of a storm, and then along comes a pandemic and couldn't do it at all. And I just hope there's some way that, I don't know if it can be done, but perhaps there's some way that we can do it next year or the year after or something like that, and make it even better than it would have been in 2020, because it's such a shame that the city lost out on that and the country lost out on that. On business, just to say, there is a 3-month rates waiver in place. It's not a deferral, it's a waiver for 3 months. There's a reopening grant of up to €10,000 available to business. There is the wage subsidy scheme, which has now been extended to August, which will pay a big part of the wage bill for businesses reopening. There is access as well to low-cost loans. On seasonal workers, we did consider that. It's not something we believe we can do. It's one thing to put in place a wage subsidy for somebody who was on the payroll. It's quite a different thing to put in place a wage subsidy for somebody who thinks that they might have been on the payroll, and it's very hard really to assess that. In terms of the supports that have been put in place for business, by no means is everything that's been announced the end of it. We appreciate that more will need to be done to help businesses reopen and survive in the coming months, and we are examining other measures and are happy to hear people's suggestions in that regard. One thing we can't do, though, is a 0% VAT rate. There is an EU VAT directive, and unless that changes, you can't introduce any new zero-rated VAT goods or services. Rates can be reduced, but not to zero in those cases. You can only have a certain number of rates. But I think more so than a lower VAT rate, what businesses really need is demand. They need footfall, they need people spending. And I do think we'll need a domestic tourism campaign to encourage people to take a break or a holiday at home over the summer period if they can afford to do so. Also to encourage people to spend in local shops and shops again. Because while a lot of people have seen their incomes very badly hit by the pandemic, there's a whole other group of people who didn't lose their jobs, who actually have been accumulating savings over the past couple of weeks and couple of months. And the best thing they can do when the economy reopens is to spend money in the economy, and they should be encouraged to do so, because in doing so, other people will then be able to get back to work. So I'd hate to see what happened during the last recession happen again, where people who maybe did have a bit of money are almost afraid to spend it. We need the reverse of that. We need to encourage people who can to spend money in the economy, so that other people who don't have money can get back to work and do the same.
Okay, Taoiseach, thank you. Deputy Healy-Rae.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Taoiseach, local authorities around the country are organising the reopening of their counties. In Kerry, we are no different. Kerry County Council, along with their elected members, are putting in place town centre mobility plans, ensuring social distancing is in place on our footpaths, etc. They are also looking at allowing street furniture for cafes, restaurants and pubs to use to ensure they can increase capacity while maintaining social distancing rules. But Taoiseach, what can you do along with the Minister for Justice to help, whereby at present you are not to consume alcohol outside or near a premise from which it is purchased? Can these laws be relaxed or temporarily even to allow for the next number of weeks and months? Also, on Tuesday at our meeting along with the other leaders, I raised the issue of hairdressers, barbers, beauticians, and I'm glad at what is being spoken about since yesterday. But what I would like, and I want to acknowledge your gratitude at that meeting for the good presentation that was given by the IHF, which I know influenced government's decision a lot also. But I would like for you to make a statement to the House outlining exactly what the government is proposing with regard to this now. And also at that meeting on Tuesday, I raised with you the issue of the 1 metre rule. And I appreciate Deputy Grealish raising this as well with you, because, for instance, in the county that I represent, which of course, as I continuously say, is the tourism capital of the world, the retaining of the 2 metre rule is going to have a very serious negative impact on our opportunities to get people back to work. Obviously, any decision that you make, I respect very much, will be done so in close conjunction with the people, give you health advice. But I would really ask you and the government to look very closely at the 2 metre rule with the potential of going down to 1 metre. It really would mean thousands of jobs, not just in the county of Kerry, but throughout the country. And finally, because I want to allow you a proper opportunity to respond, also again, I know it has been asked by others, but I have been asked by many, many parents of children with special educational requirements to raise the July provision and the whole issue of special schools and allowing for the teaching of our children who are challenged with regard to getting their education, and that the government would do and be seen to do everything they can for those very special category of young students who need help in conjunction with their parents. And thank you, Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy. I may not have picked up exactly right on people consuming alcohol outdoors or on the street. My understanding is that's not against the law. There may be bylaws in certain counties and certain city areas, but in terms of national law, drinking in alcohol in a public place in Ireland is not illegal. Being drunk and disorderly is. That's an entirely different thing. But just having the 1 pint perhaps or 2 or 3 glasses is not against the law. Or the Phoenix Park, for that matter. Just in relation to the 2 metre rule, I think, as I mentioned earlier, while there are different advices from different bodies, everyone agrees that 2 metres is safer than 1, and 3 metres will be safer again. Roughly a 1 metre distance gives you maybe 70–80% protection from somebody who is carrying the virus. 2 metres closer to 95%. So, you know, we should be honest with people that if we're going to go from 2 metres to 1 metre, that is an additional risk. It's much less of a risk than it was a few weeks ago when the virus was circulating in the community to a much greater extent than it is now. So it would be a calculated risk to go from 2 metres to 1. But the risk of not doing it also exists, as you've mentioned. Being unable to open schools fully, that has consequences too. Not being able to open the hospitality sector properly, potentially 80,000 people not being able to get back to work, that has consequences too, not just economic consequences, also health consequences. So a bit of work is now being done involving the HPSC and also government departments really to calculate and quantify that risk so that if we make a decision to change the advice or to make exceptions to the advice, that we know the risk we're taking. It's a risk and analysis, if you like, and we'd expect to have that concluded hopefully next week.
The hairdressers, Taoiseach. Well, do you know what? It strikes me that all the heads I've been able to see here this morning, despite the concern for the barbers and the hairdressers, are fairly well coiffed. Deputy McGrath.
Taoiseach, I wanted to acknowledge the concessions that have been made in bringing forward some of the stages, but the over 66s, Taoiseach, are still neglected. And they're not looking for much. All they wanted was the difference between their pension and what the COVID payment was getting, because they have and still do play a big part in our society. Mobile businesses, Taoiseach, they're badly affected, and there are many. From the bread van to the milkman to the ready-mix driver, the block driver, and indeed, you know, the many services that are out there. The service people come into our house, our yards with fresh fish. God knows, you name it, they're there. And because they're not paying rates, because they're mobile, they're getting nothing. And it's very unfair. And I was astounded to hear Heather Humphreys, the Minister for Business Enterprise, saying that they were in a better position to deal with it than others. How could they be? They've been stopped dead in their tracks and they have had no income. It's very, very bad there. Taoiseach, the childcare. I don't know why you can't use the fabulous array of community centres that are up and down almost every community now. And thanks to government grants, but thanks to teams of volunteers that put them there, that were the enablers, I call them. And the community hall should be used for the childcare. They are using some area. In my own village, Dunedin uses the community hall as an add-on, but they could be used. They're big as well. Taoiseach, the barbers, we did discuss it the other day, Deputy Healy-Rae said, and I know you had a letter from Willie Walsh, a wonderful barber in Clonmel. They need to get going. And there's no clarity. There's some bit of a story this morning in the paper. But Taoiseach, are you going to direct an effort to ensure that barbers especially, and some hairdressers, I know it takes a bit longer to do the ladies' hair than it does the men's, so it's a difficult issue, but nonetheless, the black market is thriving here and is killing our economy, and killing those businesses, the one I speak of, and many more, Liam Wall and Care, and many others, they're open with 40 years and doing a business and good employment, and they have invested hugely in their premises now to do it safely and to do it well. Taoiseach, I also want to say to private bus companies who bring our children to school, there's a 50% of them are CIE contract that are bus air contracts now, and they're getting the 50% of their income, which is necessary and help. But there are a large cohort, and I know many of them, such as Denny Whelan and Kea, who they provide bus services to families who can't get the service from bus air, and they provided the very same insurance, the very same standards. The bus has to be DOE and everything else, just rightly so, and they're not getting a penny. And they can't afford, and we need them back in September when the schools reopen again, so they should be out there, so they're neglected also. The July provision has been mentioned, Taoiseach. It's just awful. And I welcome that some GA pitches and playing pitches are open now for limited time for them to get in there. They've been stuck in their houses. Taoiseach, I have one question to ask you, and it's a serious one. 74,000 people responded to the call to Help Ireland, to help in our HSE, in our hospitals, and only 140 were employed. What is wrong? That kind of a rising and a spirit of the people, and yet and that 74,000 was whittled down because a lot of them were denied, they didn't qualify. Of the 74,000, only 140 were employed. And yet, Taoiseach, we're still spending the huge money on the private hospitals. I know we had to take them over, I supported it, but I believe the month of June they should have been given back, because the number of people waiting for all kinds of tests, the cervical checks, the breast check, you name them. Prostate cancer, we have advertised our Taoiseach Kenny now, you might get a job if you're out of a job next week, if Micheál takes over from you, and the radio supporting the hospice. I'm just making the point that so many people waiting for so many operations and so much capacity going to waste, and the queues are going to be massive for the winter. So Taoiseach, look, those questions, but could you really answer me about, as I said, revenue commissioners, Taoiseach? Many of the grants, again, to start up, people have been told because you haven't your tax up to date, you're not getting it. There should be some leniency with revenue, especially with tax this year, because everything just closed overnight and people weren't able to do their books and get their tax in, and they have no revenue to pay it. So there must be some understanding there on the revenue that people, this year's taxation, if it's an arrears going on a long time, different story, but it's the current, it should get a break. Thank you. You might give me one answer here.
Thanks, Deputy. I can assure you I'll still be Taoiseach next week, so you don't need to do any sayonaras just yet, Deputy. Just in relation to the private hospitals, the contract for that ends at the end of June, so it's really only a couple of weeks now, and the private hospital contract will end. Although the HSE is now trying to negotiate a new arrangement with the private hospitals to allow them to step in if, for some reason, we need the beds at a later stage, and also using the NTPF to get some work done for public patients that needs to be done. Just in relation to the On Call for Ireland campaign, yes, a very large number of people expressed an interest. Quite a large number weren't suitably qualified. Quite a large number already worked in health and social care. For example, people working in nursing homes. And rather than moving them to hospitals, we wanted to keep them in the nursing homes for reasons people would understand. So, and what also happened there as well is a lot of people were recruited locally anyway, rather than going through the HSC central system, which can be quite cumbersome at a local level, at a hospital level, at a community level. Managers were empowered to recruit locally, and in a lot of cases that's how it was done instead of through the central system.
Marion Harkin.
Mágad agus ní mór dom a ráidús intim le ceanara ina fáil agus na teachta dála eile go bhfuil gá pránach le cintocht ó híh grúgarí na tíre ach ní mór dom a adúbáil go bhfuil cuimhlint lesa agam cos tá sé Jackar domsa. Taoiseach, I think there's an urgent necessity, and I agree with the leader of Fianna Fáil and the other TDs in relation to the hairdressing situation in Ireland, and I confess to a conflict of interest myself in relation to this matter. But we're talking about a minimum of 25,000, not to mention the linked companies and industries and small businesses. So we do need certainty, and I think they have shown that they can comply with whatever rules are necessary. I also welcome tomorrow that there's going to be some certainty in relation to the July provision. I've raised it many times with you and with the Department, with the Minister for Education. Today, bhuatlam diru asja kursi miarslancha. Agus is ábhar is tá sé ansad do Macrí agus tá sé ordaí go minic agam ó 2016 agus faríor géir tá orm orda a ríis inniu. Mental health. Taoiseach, and I'm going to allow a minute or two for you to answer because, I mean, it's a very net issue in relation to the vision for change. The roadmap has been mentioned very often in relation to COVID. We've had a roadmap in relation to mental health services. I prefer to call it a vision, and indeed that's the title, Vision for Change. And the journey started in 1984 with a document called Planning for the Future because we realised that the model then wasn't suitable. And then it took another over 20-something years to get the Vision for Change, which is absolutely visionary. And as I've highlighted repeatedly, and I have an utter sense of frustration in relation to this matter, because at the time when the Vision of Change was published, it was recognised that no government, not just your government, Taoiseach, but no government could be trusted. And so an independent monitoring body was set up, and it's set for 2 different periods, and it did an excellent job. And I've asked you repeatedly, why can't you put back the independent monitoring body to show your bona fides, if nothing else, while you wait for the review or the renewal or whatever it's called in relation to Vision for Change. And in relation to that, since 2016, I have made nearly the same speech and implored you to do something. And first of all, we found out that there was a review of a literature which took a very short period of time. In fact, the date on it is February 17. It wasn't published till July 17. And then we got another approach that we'd have a review or refresh. And in the meantime, the core point, the absence of an independent monitoring body to review the implementation of the Vision for Change and whatever necessary changes are needed. I'm going to stop, Taoiseach, to allow you. Please don't tell me what's spent on mental health. I'm asking you a very net question in relation to an independent monitoring body.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Deputy. I am going to tell you because I think it is important. Back in 2012, only about €700 million a year was spent on mental health in Ireland. This year, for the first time, it's over £1 billion. So since my party came to office, a 44% increase in funding for mental health. Unfortunately, I doubt that future governments will be able to do quite as well as that, but I have no doubt that they will try. Vision for Change kind of ran out in 2016, and there is a successor document that was approved by Cabinet last Thursday, and Minister Dáil and Minister Harris intend to publish that, I think, next week. And that will really inform, I think, the actions of the next government. And in that document is a commitment to establishing an independent monitoring body. So that's the plan, is to publish the new refresh document, already approved by Cabinet next week, and to allow the new government to establish an independent monitoring body for that, to hold our feet to the fire, if you like, and to make sure that it gets implemented.
That there's going to be an independent monitoring body. I don't agree with you that the Vision for Change ran out. The date ran out 2006 to 16, but the vision contained therein and the implementation and what they set out in every sector, and the fact that it was a partnership with the community, with families, and to rebalance the power in the whole mental health sector. All of that was clearly set out with vision. None of that is dated. The problem is it wasn't implemented. So I welcome the good news. Corm fáilteam go mór rev an Kinishin go mai an rud neamhsplach a rash chun manatóireacht a dhéanamh cuasaí mearslánte. Garamagat.
Thank you, Taoiseach, again, I'd like to raise the issue of supports to small business. I did so last week as well, because in the intervening period, I've spoken to so many small business owners, and they speak about an escalating crisis in the sector. Now, time and time again, I've spoken to both you and Minister Humphreys about the mounting wall of debt that many of these businesses are facing. Yes, you've put loan schemes in place, and they are useful, but interest rates are too high, and loans mean that these businesses are piling debt upon debt. And many of them cannot afford to do this, because the average SME carries between €7,000 and €8,000 in debt extra because of COVID. And many of them, of course, know that when they reopen, it could take 6 months or maybe even 12 before they return to their previous trading position. And in the meantime, they'll be struggling just to stay afloat. Now, as I said, you have your loan scheme in place and your Restart grant, but the take-up is low, Taoiseach. And Minister Humphreys has committed 250 million. But many SMEs will only be able to access the minimum amount of 2,000 because of rates paid last year. And I think if we contrast our response to that of Germany, Germany has 50 billion in federal grants pledged to SMEs. Now, the equivalent for Ireland would be about 2.9 billion. We're talking about 250 million in grant aid. That's about 1/10 what Germany is allocating. I just want to know, why is there a reluctance to step in to support businesses that account for 65% of unemployment and 31% of our exports? And also, Taoiseach, I raised it with you the last day about those businesses that don't pay rates, the wedding industry, the tour operators, the man in the van, the man in the bus, the plumber, the electrician. You did say you would look at that, and again I'm asking, can you confirm that you will? And the other point I want to make, Taoiseach, is that, as often happens in this country, we have an economy within an economy. The 3 regional assemblies have compiled a report on the impact of COVID. Now, it's not good for any region, but it's particularly grim for the North West and the border. And I'll just highlight one particular statistic which reflects overall what is in this report. And it looked at 64 settlements throughout the country and their exposure to significant economic disruption caused by COVID-19. The 2 top towns are Bundoran in Donegal at 75% and Strandhill in Sligo at 70%. And Carrick-on-Shannon comes number 17, mostly in Leitrim, tiny bit in Roscommon, out of 64. So the report makes it clear that the economic impact of COVID is more severely felt in the North West and the border, and we can see the impact in smaller towns and villages. So what I'm saying to you, Taoiseach, is we can't wait any longer, because if we wait too long, viable businesses become vulnerable, and vulnerable businesses are likely to close. My final comment is that at EU level, the unthinkable has happened. They've relaxed the fiscal rules. Written in blood, we had a referendum here on the fiscal rules, yet France and Germany and Denmark all recognise that they have to support their businesses, state aid. So I'm asking you, Taoiseach, in the 50 seconds that's left, to please commit to a significant upgrading and increasing of the supports that we have already in place for SMEs. Thank you.
The fiscal rules, as you'll know from your time as an MEP, always had provision to be relaxed in circumstances like this. They were never what the opponents made them out to be, and indeed they were relaxed. And we will borrow something like 30 billion this year, maybe 10% of GDP, the biggest deficit in a very long time. So we're certainly not being shy when it comes to spending money and borrowing money on behalf of future generations to get us through this crisis. There is in place a rates waiver for 3 months. Tax liabilities are being warehoused. There's a reopening grant of up to 10,000. The uptake is not low, it's actually high. We're going to have to put more money into that because the uptake is so high. There's debt deferral mechanisms from the banks, low-cost loans available, and a whole plethora of other grants, including online trading grants and grants from the LEOs. Yes, we are examining other additional measures, and that work is being done currently by the Department of Business and the Department of Public Expenditure. I am interested to hear what you said about Germany. I didn't know that. That's significant information for me. If it's grants and loans, we're actually in a similar space. If what Germany is doing is all grants, then they're doing a lot more than us. So I'd be interested if you have any more information on that you can share with me. Just in terms of businesses and sole traders that are not rateable, and you did raise this with me last week, we are examining that. The reopening grant is based on a rebate of your rates. Because they don't pay rates, they don't qualify. We're looking perhaps at a different mechanism of maybe giving them some of their income tax back from a previous year as a means to help them get their business going again. So that's what we're examining with regard to that.
Brisher fa fihin o maid.